Welcome everybody to my phenomenal conversation with Anna-Marie Swann. We're going to be working title is Exploring Organizations. And before I ask Anna-Marie to introduce herself, I'm just going to say a little bit about Phenomenal Conversations and today's format. So Phenomenal Conversations interview change makers like Anna-Marie that embody regenerative change. We attempt to expand imagination in the midst of the polycrisis. We're trying to amplify meaningfulness in a chaotic world, and also ask profound questions. And today's format is a one-on-one interview format, but once monthly, largely on the last Tuesday of the month, we also have a live event format where you're welcome to come and participate and join in with the change makers and explore for yourself in real time, in your lived experience, the issues that we explore on the day. So that being said, welcome again to Anna-Marie. And I don't do a bio on the change makers I interview. I like them to sort of present a short sketch about themselves and the journey they've come so far. And of course, we're going to dive into detail on quite a lot of the things you've had explored and hopefully produce something. I'm pretty excited about ecological organizations. I think they're extremely rare, if non-existent.
Yes.
I'd love to hear more from you about your way of encouraging this to form. So, but before we go there, do tell us a little bit about your background history so the average listener can get an idea of where you're coming from and how you came to where you are now.
Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed, I've enjoyed all the conversations we've had, so it's lovely to bring that here. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so I'm based in Devon in the UK, and I would say this is like the first place that I've really felt like is becoming home, and that's quite important to me because I'm heading to 50 now, and so it's been a really central part of my life. I feel like I'm walking myself into place here, and I think that really saturates my perspectives and my work. I live here with my husband, and yeah, we've been here about 2 years. What else to say? So I come from, my line, my kind of lineage. I'm half English and half Croatian. My father's line goes back kind of through to like Wales and Scotland. My mother's line is in Croatia and the kind of Baltic area, but I don't have any contact with that part of the family. And again, I think that's something that's really informed my perspectives, a lot of my questions about myself and my work. I've been navigating chronic health issues for most of my adult life, so about 30 years now. And again, I think that gives me a very particular lens to look through to kind of navigate that. It's a very kind of internal experience, but at the same time, it's led me to really look outside of myself in a way that I think is quite, perhaps I don't see so often in the level of curiosity I have about kind of myself in the world. And then work-wise, my work comes under, two particular, I guess, branches of the same fascination, which is how do we move through this world as deeply ecological creatures? And so that splits into two parts: the ecological organizations, which you've already pointed to, which holds that questions for organizations. And then I've been, over the last few years, also developing this form of inquiry called Ecological Inquiry. And that is really for individuals, groups, and organizations as well, to really ask ourselves and understand and start to unravel some of the kind of, what does it mean to be a deeply complex relational creature? What informs us? What are we informing on a daily basis? And so, all of that, I guess, comes together, hopefully to paint a bit of a picture of where I'm coming from. But at the center of, I guess, what I currently find most fascinating is the subject of, how do we move through this incredibly complex world and do that as complex creatures that are in deep daily relationship of some sort, and what happens when we start to notice that as our reality.
Well, beautiful, beautifully, commendably short. So thanks for that. And also, I hesitate. Well, I think there's an alignment because I think the core of my life is also lived inquiry, and I think ecological
Yes.
inquiry is incredibly important because actually we're wired to oversimplify in some way,
Yes,
and I think there's some sort of alignment with Nora Bateson's work as well.
I'm sure.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
I think that she lives and breathes that. So there's a great I feel a great resonance just with the way you've presented that with her work. So you shared a little bit of your life story with me before, and I'd like to just dig in a little bit to
Sure.
the what drew you in the first place in the earlier part of this organizational journey to self-managed organizations.
Yeah.
What attracted you to that way of organizing? Because I think that underpins where you're at now, and I think I'd love to
Yes.
unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. It definitely does. Yeah, it's I can almost take myself back to the moment I picked up Frederick Laloux's Reinventing Organizations and the impact it had on me, because I was at a time in my life where I'd really struggled in my career. I never really knew what I wanted to do or where would suit me or where my skills landed. And I was working as a PA at the time, and I was a really good PA. But it just wasn't deeply fulfilling. But excuse me, I landed what I thought was a dream job working for this huge organization, charity in the UK, which was always a big dream of mine, to work for a charity or for a not-for-profit and to be doing meaningful work. And I was so shocked and disappointed. I spent 6 months in one of the biggest charities in the UK, and then went to a very small not-for-profit. And I was so shocked at the relational experience of being in those. So the unhappiness, the kind of stresses people are experiencing, the dislocation, the kind of dehumanization, the hierarchies that were at play, the kind of it felt really harmful environments.
Where charity didn't begin at home.
Right, exactly. And that, I think, I'm sure I went in there with a very idealistic view, but my expectation was that people that care deeply about other people and the world around them would create these environments that were joyful, and we brought our whole selves to work, and they were really supportive. And I found the opposite. Some incredible people, but just the systems themselves seemed to be set up to dehumanize and to create these hierarchies. And so I can't remember why I picked up the book, but I did, and it was just felt like it was a revelation to me. It was like this, at that point, it felt like this was what I was dreaming of, such deep care. And
Yeah.
that led me, as we've talked about, onto this 7-year journey, really diving into self-organization and decision making and governance, and all of the kind of related subjects about like how do we work together and how do we do that in a way that's useful and helpful to the world. Yeah, all of that.
Yes, and one of the I remember that early outpouring of enthusiasm and was part of that movement towards self-organizations myself.
Yeah.
However, that's something you moved away from. So what was
Yes.
it that you felt was lacking, even though this was very ideal and people wanted to treat others, treat the planet, somewhat of the planet and the world as not as entities to be extracted and exploited. So what
Yeah.
was it? What were the shortcomings in that world that made you want to look again at other ways of working in organizations?
Yeah. Thank you I love how you've phrased that as well. Um, because I think that's exactly was my experience, was this growing sense of, I guess, an unease that felt like even though I had the opportunity to work with incredible people, having the most incredible conversations are really about um, decolonialism and different ways of doing things and how we would be together and all of these incredible and I got to explore things like sociocracy and holacracy, which, as you probably know, but some people might not know, is these various well-established and well-respected governance protocols, which have so much to offer. But I would find that this unease was growing about this kind of sense that, I guess, if two things, which was that, firstly, even with all of that, there was still a sense that people were treating organizations in a mechanical way,
Right.
as though they were these dead entities that, and I didn't experience them like that. I experienced them almost through a kind of animist lens, like they were a being that
Yeah.
came into life when people gathered, that had its own, that I could almost sense, like another member that was sitting in a group meeting would be the organization itself, that
Yeah.
had perhaps perspectives. And it sounds a bit odd to say that, but it felt very alive to me, and I couldn't understand why people didn't experience it like I did. This kind of sense of, we got to be with this new being that had
Yeah.
formed, that was very much alive. But there was also this, I think we talked about this before, there was this sense that even even in the most kind of socially or environmentally focused project that were exploring these things, there was still some disconnect between this sense of their kind of ecological impact.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
so and I would notice that even, and I still don't, I wrestle with this now, I don't really understand it, that, even talks of kind of impact and regeneration and metrics, I would always have these questions of, but how do you know it's regenerative? How do you really know that over the long term, the impact that you think is positive
Mm.
might in 100 years show up to be
Yeah.
unhelpful? So I
Yeah.
just found a lot of the framings and the ideas, even, in these incredible projects, and um, just didn't make sense to me. Just left me with these questions, and yeah, the kind of the yeah. Let's leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Okay. Just so, I mean, that's a critique, and you're talking about amazing people.
Hmm.
You can you give an instance, you don't have to say the name or anything, of where you think it was really worked? Was there, where you thought, oh, this was kind of peak functioning or self-organizing situations? Do you have an example to share of that?
Of where I've experienced it
Yeah,
working well.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Because Lou's book is full of them, but kind of
Yeah,
curious.
you see, that's the framing, isn't it? That's,
Yeah,
I think we talked about this before. Like we talked about how, yeah, I feel this disconnect. Yes, so I mean, Patagonia to me is probably the one that
yeah,
comes to mind the most, because why I particularly appreciate Patagonia, as well as doing incredibly innovative things like making Earth a shareholder,
yeah,
they've also recognized, I think it was the founder who said something along the lines, and it's not the right words, but we are too successful to be a truly regenerative organization. So
right,
even they recognized that the business world, the system of business itself, they were just they even with everything they're doing, and they're held up as a pinnacle, and I think it's incredible.
yeah,
Um, Even they recognize that the system itself,
yeah.
yeah, means that they can't be what they would like to be.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's quite answering your question,
No,
but
but I think, I mean, I take from what you're saying is that the kind of existent conditions of the business world make it almost impossible to succeed and be truly regenerative or ecological. Just
yeah, whichever framing it is. I mean, I have challenges with the framing of regenerative as how it's being used, which is why I chose to work with the framing of ecological, because it makes more sense to me. But yeah, I think so. Yeah, I when I was thinking through your question, yes, there are probably real examples of, I mean, one of the organizations that I was with recently as a role was Nesta, Nestr, not Nesta with an A, but Nesta with an R, and they make, and they are a holacracy-based organization, and they live and breathe holacracy. So in that sense, yes, I think there are lots of examples of, like you say, like in Frederick Ballou's book, of organizations that have managed to really adopt and embody self-organization. But whether that's enough, it doesn't feel enough to me.
Right. Okay, well, we'll leave it there because we're here to talk about
Yeah.
ecological organizations. And I'm thinking, let's just go on to your design lens, and then we'll other questions that I'll try and just so you've got a design lens, and I think that you're using that language intentionally as well.
Yeah.
Because it's not a map, it's not a thing, it's really a design lens.
Yeah.
So you've got, was it 7 or 8 key components in that?
That's a good question. I'm going to have to look. You work with something so closely, and yes, 8. That's right.
8. Okay. So could you sketch for the person that hasn't heard of it
Yeah.
before, a kind of summary of what you've got in there, and then we can dig into it a bit more as we go through.
Yeah, so the design lens is, as you say, so it was launched as the Ecological Organizations framework. That felt like an unhelpful framing. It's now version 2, so the design lens, and it's really so it's formed, as you say, of these 8 elements that to me form this kind of particular, like a living system. We can choose to look at it like that. And then in each of those are,
I'm gonna stop you there. Let's just highlight that, because you were talking about your frustrations, even in the self-managed world, of the kind of people's deep mechanical perceptions of organization.
Yes.
Let's just highlight that, the lived experience of an ecological organization.
Yeah.
Unpack that a little bit.
As a living system.
Yeah, because I think that's the core of the model, and that might be helpful to just
Yeah.
that's what you're aiming for here. That's what the design lens is for.
Yes, is to help people engage with the organizations as a living system. Absolutely. So I would refer then to our wonderful colleague and friend Michelle Holliday, that we both do lots of work with in OD for Life, who leads this incredible work on thrivability. And she has a wonderful way of describing the difference, which is that, so a mechanical system, a kind of dead system, you think of as something like a car. It's got lots of parts. The parts play the role. And we know it's working or not by if the car's running. But it's very mechanical, right? So there's nothing it's not going to start making decisions of its own. Certainly, there's AI cars might, but at the moment, cars are not going to start making decisions of their own. But in a living system, which is how I view organizations, and I think you do too, we're recognizing that among the parts and the relationships, there is life itself. So there are living aspects. So those parts in a living system have a life of their own. And together, that means that what you're having now are these complex systems, because any part, like let's take an organization, some of those parts are human beings, and we all make decisions all the time, and we bring things to life through us. We animate them. So a living system has that extra element. It's something alive. So an ecosystem is a living system, a social system. All of those things have living elements to them.
Yeah. So the in a way, ecological organizations in a way is a way of new way of seeing organizations as living systems, you might say.
Yeah, it's a lens we can, a story. I mean,
Yeah.
that's how I view it. It's a story. There's
Sure.
so many different ways. And I certainly am not the first person to put this lens on or
No.
to see that as a story, but it's just, yeah, it's my, I guess it's the story that makes most sense to me at this time in the world that we're living in.
So then if you could, now we've got that
Yeah,
established, if
yeah.
you could just talk about the elements that you feel that central to an organization adopting or perceiving that it is a living system. What is it, the elements that you bring in that you feel are important in that way of seeing or interacting with the world?
Yeah, well, so it's what I find really interesting about the work that this work of ecological organizations, and I really feel like it's taking me on a journey, and I get to learn so much by being in relationship with this story and idea. I feel like there's sort of two elements really that I would be encouraging an organization to inquire into if they
Yeah,
were
yeah,
interested in becoming more ecological, which is really the first is this underlying kind of question of what does it mean to be ecological? Now, for me, there's some core elements in that, which is that it's an ongoing process. There's no end goal to this.
yeah,
And that's, I think, a very different approach than most organizations take in either their work or in how they approach themselves, which is that mostly they're looking to get to measurable end goals
yeah,
that you can do a strategy towards. But for me, to being ecological is a recognition of, yeah, the living systems are in constant change, the environments are in constant change
yeah,
as well, the relationships are in constant change. So I would be encouraging an organization to really inquire into that, like, and can they take that as a kind of springboard for their
right,
explorations, that this could be multi-generational work that they may never see the end of, that there probably is no end place to get to because all the information is consistently being made new by us
yeah,
just
yeah,
moving through time together.
yeah.
So I would encourage them to kind of inquire into that and really understand and start to pull apart what does that mean for them as organizations if they take that worldview that
Yeah.
to be ecological is to always be changing and to never reach some end goal.
I'm going to just question you that on a bit because I think that, you know, most savvy organizations reckon the nature of the complexity of the change. What is it that, you know, trends in markets, competition from customers, buying habits change, economy changes. So what is the difference between the kind of accepted kind of market conditions, ways of seeing change, and what you're pointing to in terms of constant change? Or, you know, is there a difference, or maybe you're pointing to something more, or
You see, no, I have to think about that. It's interesting because firstly, what comes up is that I'm not in the kind of current business world anymore. So so I'm going to take your word for it in a way, and I'm sure that's true, that's what savvy businesses are. Yes, there's a responsiveness. Yeah, perhaps what ecological organizations is pointing to is something a bit deeper
yeah,
than just being responsive to kind of changing external environment or
okay,
relationships. It's pointing to, I guess, the other aspect of what I think of as a kind of core element of an ecological organization, which is that the so-called organizational boundaries are co-created stories. There is no real boundary between the organization and what's happening outside. So what's happening within and without these so-called boundaries and borders, are in deep relationship, and perhaps that might be a different perspective than even savvy businesses might do. So they might take the lens, they're constantly looking externally and they're responding to clients, but they might still view what happens within them in some way as being separate from their environment, from place, from the kind of depth of complexity.
Okay, so there's some avoidance of the true depth of complexity of the way that everything.
I mean, this feels a little bit like guesswork. I don't know to like paint a full picture across the board, but I guess if I go back to my experience of the multiple different projects and organizations I've been a part of, that I have found that to be true. That there's either a inner focus, there can, most organizations will focus on culture and they'll focus on the change outside of them, but I feel like they still believe that their borders are real, that somehow there isn't this fluidity that runs through every aspect, both internal and out.
I'll offer something that I saw as you were describing this. There's also something about, there's always ends, means, and goals and objectives. There's a kind of always finite things that will help you achieve. But I think you're almost talking to that the core of the business always needs to be evolving in its relationships to its environment and all the complexity around it. So there's something about the core essence.
Yeah, that's true. That's how the lens would ask people to look at it. Yeah, and say, I think seasonality is definitely a key part of what it is to be ecological, and to recognize that seasonality in all aspects. Absolutely.
Okay, so so you've mentioned the one, you said there was two things you'd encourage anybody. So the first one is about the essence of an ecological organization is always alive and it's always having impacts much further in the future than you might realize at the time.
So it's this sort of multi-generational perspective, I guess, this long-term, ongoing, ever-changing perspective of what it means to be ecological. And then the other aspect really is what we were talking about, which is that this recognition of that the boundaries are stories that we have created.
Oh, okay.
That there is no separation possible between kind of being within an organization and being without. We don't leave any part of ourselves at home, even if we kind of shut things off when we go in. There is no way so that would be the two kind of areas. Really, I'd ask an organization to really explore for itself. Does it believe that there are true borders between itself and the world outside? And if so, can it really find them? Because I've never been able to truly find those.
Okay, well, I want to dive into some aspects of the lens, but I'd like to just pause the explanation of the lens more that your experience as a founder and a source of this, like this is really you've paid a lot of attention to your lived experience, and out of that you recognize that organizations are living systems, and you've developed this design lens. What's it like to be a founder of something that's so well before early adoption, you might say? It's like really pioneering, but unrecognized. So tell us just a little bit about the founder experience. I think there'll be people in my network that are on this journey of very early, what's it called, niche development of novel things. I think they'd like to hear from you your experience of, evolving and developing something very original, and just the founder and source. dimension.
Sure, sure. Well, firstly, that's, a very kind description. It's funny because in some ways, yeah, it does feel original and it also doesn't. I often frame it as a reimagined story because I don't think it's anything new, but it's
Yeah,
just I've managed to assemble it perhaps in a and one of the things that I should mention that's been a real joy as part of this founder experience has been the amount of people that will contact me and say, "Oh, I saw your lens," or back then when it was the framework, and I had also been thinking about all these things and I just didn't have the name for it. And as soon as I read the phrase
right.
ecological
Okay.
organization, it was like,
Yeah,
yes, that was it. And so
yeah,
that sense that this wasn't about me at all, that actually there are lots of people seeing this, I
yeah,
find deeply reassuring and exciting. But yeah, the journey has been, I mean, it's been incredible. It's been strange. It's been terrifying. It's been all of those things. So firstly, I didn't intend there was no intentionality to this development. So the
right.
reason that the first framework came about is that, say, I had hit this point, I was feeling very and and unease with certain ways that organizations were being, and I was reflecting for myself, where do I go? Where's my kind of home area? I didn't feel quite at home in the self-organization world anymore, and that field or regenerative kind of project field and work. And I wanted to reflect for myself what I was seeing and what mattered to me, but mostly as an exercise to be able to share that with potential clients that
Yeah,
might want to come and work with me. And it
yeah,
was my husband that encouraged me to see it as something actually that might be a bit beyond that. And so I
yeah,
was terrified when I shared it because I couldn't see how anyone beyond me would, or maybe a few clients, but I really couldn't see how anyone would really find this of interest.
yeah,
But I was also really convinced that surely that the phrase ecological organization must have been developed because it made so much sense to me.
yeah,
And I spent throughout that time of writing the kind of launch article, which took a good few months, I kept Googling ecological organizations over and over again and in different forms to try and, because I was convinced that someone somewhere has already done this.
yeah,
And so I spent the first few months after the launch of my article, even though it had such a lovely response, and that was wonderfully surprising, convinced that I was going to wake up to an email somewhere from some angry person who said, I've written this book all about ecological organizations, but it's in Spanish, so you wouldn't have known because you're very English focused. And there's I think some part of me waiting for that to happen, but it hasn't yet.
yeah,
But yeah, the founder experience, yeah, I mean, it's been incredibly challenging in the sense that, for example, over the last year, as we've talked about, I've made multiple funding applications to get some funding to develop it because it's such an early stage and it needs some maturing. And I don't have, the capacity to do that on my own. And
yeah, yeah,
I shouldn't do it. It should be a more collective
mm,
gaze. But I've been unsuccessful with all of those. I do have this open funding out at the moment, and which has had immense support, but again, no one coming forward to fund. So and one of the tensions or questions that's felt really important to me is I've discovered myself in this founder role in a new way than I've founded things, but not something that's sort of so much come from my own DNA and my perspective
yeah,
and
yeah,
presenting that, which is a whole new experience, is this I have such deep care and feel such responsibility to do what's right for the work and to protect the work and to try and separate out my needs from what the work needs so that I can try and look at it with as much of a stewardship or a caretaker
yeah, yeah,
perspective. And
yeah,
at the same time, I have my needs.
yeah,
And so lots of people have very strong opinions about how I could make money from
yeah,
this. And it's really important to me that Design Lens is released in Creative Commons for non-commercial use. It really needs, I think, at this stage, a lot of protection and
Yeah.
development and research
Yeah.
that done in a way that isn't influenced by the kind of subtle pulls of business investment or if I was to take it as a consultant now, I don't even know how I would consult with it now because it's so early.
Yeah.
It really does need
Yeah.
maturing, and that's hard.
Well, that's there's an aspect of the model. You've mentioned it before that you're developing two strands. One is ecological
Mhm.
organizations and ecological inquiry.
That's right.
When I think I'd seen the framework first,
Right.
downloaded it, and then when I read it again and looked at it more closely, I was struck by this is a design lens that has no things in it.
Yeah,
Has
you
no,
said that. Tell me what you mean by things. What does
well, abstract qualities like resilience or
ah,
things like authenticity or I don't know, governance or typical things you might find at the center of organization. There's no
yeah.
things in there. What you've got is questions.
Right.
I find this really interesting, and I'm curious about why the map and the various dimensions of it, which we've only mentioned a couple,
Yeah.
all are have 3 or 4 or 5 inquiry questions.
Mm,
Why is that central to becoming an ecological organization? Uh,
yeah.
I'm curious about that. I think that's an interesting development you've come to there.
Yeah. Well, that I would lay at the feet very much fully at Dr. Daniel Christian Wahl and
Yeah.
his work on. Oh, sorry, that's my. Let me just turn that off. Yeah, Daniel.
So you're saying Daniel
Yeah.
Christian Wall and living the questions, I assume?
That's right, exactly. So I was reading, I'd started reading Designing Regenerative Cultures just as I had for myself put together what was going to be my first, say, framework for trying to find people to work with that aligned with my perspectives. And it wasn't questions, actually. It was we should do this and we should do that. And I realized soon as I read his provocation to live in the questions, that there was something I was unconsciously recreating what I was not looking for, which was these kind of end goal, like
Yeah.
there is an answer to these things that can just be applied. And as soon as I changed my perspective and I sat back and I started to reflect on, but what is the deeper question beneath this? Then it felt like I was getting to a much more useful place, which is that really respecting and honoring and celebrating the fact that to be ecological is a very unique experience for every single human organization group. We can have shared threads and we can have conversations about are we truly separate from one another and does that remove us from being kind of whole and complete, which I don't think it does. But at the heart of being what it is to be ecological is to recognize that, especially with organizations, that every organization is going to have making different choices, what's right for them, dependent on their environment, and
Yeah.
dependent on so many things that only they will be able to see for themselves, like where are they, their language, culture, their histories, and so something came to life in the lens and in this work through that choice of changing them to questions.
Mm.
And actually one of the I think really important changes between the first version, the framework, and the second
Yeah.
version
Yeah.
is that I've I've created even more space for organizations to discover their own framings and language and stories for
Yeah.
themselves, which I think in the first version, for example, in the first version, there's an element that's all about right relationship. And that's what I mean, I love that as a framing, but it doesn't have to be that framing. There's a deeper question beneath it
Mm.
which can help organizations discover their own framings. And
Right.
so, yeah, to be ecological really is about this self-discovery
Yeah.
for every organization. And that's going to change over time, but be incredibly unique.
Well, I'm gonna, there's just that, there's, you've repeated it a few times and it interests me. I think it points to the kind of organic fluidity of the world we all actually do inhabit,
Yeah,
ignore, or are trained, conditioned to ignore, about being ecological.
right.
So the being of ecologicalness.
Yes.
You speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I said earlier, I think one of these wonderful things about being in Source has been how much this work has kind of taken me on a journey.
Yeah,
And one of the most, I guess, the biggest impact it's had for me is the journey into what does it mean for me to be ecological?
yeah,
And the
yeah,
work has really helped me ask that question for myself,
yeah,
and saturate it. And what I discover with that, and again, perhaps why I frame this work as ecological rather than regenerative is that um, it seems to me that we are all ecological. That's just a an innate part of being human, whether, like you say, whether we recognize it or not, we are
yeah,
ecological. Um, we are deeply informed by so much on a daily basis that informs our thoughts, our perspectives, our behaviors, our experiences, our ideas, our hopes. You start to explore into that and you're finding, yeah, place, neighborhood, ancestral lines, histories, possible futures, ecosystems, social systems, current events. It's just, you start to kind of really examine how deeply relational we are and
yeah,
how much we're interacting not just with ourselves, not just with each other, but with the more than human and the
yeah,
all of these different elements. Then to me it becomes just an innate truth that we are ecological.
mm,
But there's something that happens when we start to recognize that becomes the being ecological to
okay,
me, which is through that recognition. And what I've noticed that when we start to recognize that, we really notice it and pay attention to it and celebrate it and honor it, then something can start to change in how we are being within those
yeah,
relationships, how we are being in our neighborhoods and in our place, how we're treating the more than human world, how we can start to take responsibility for the worldviews and cosmologies we hold, for
yeah,
the actions we take. So
yeah,
there's something to me that shifts from that recognition to, now I want to start being responsible
yeah.
within my relationships.
I think what you're saying reminds me, you're kind of been at pains to point out, in a way this isn't new,
Yeah.
but I think what you're evoking or expressing there is the kind of uh, ancient perennial indigenous wisdom, but in sort of waking up in a kind of modern collapsing world, as it
Right.
were, with a kind of contemporary expression of what it means. That's what I'm hearing as you're speaking about it.
Well, yeah, I think that would be that feels a wonderful, yeah, maybe that is I'm managing to give voice to something that many of us are feeling and
Yeah,
seeing,
yeah,
which is that the immensity of it.
yeah.
Mm.
And I think we're going to need to close shortly,
Sure.
but I'm curious. I know that, you've talked about the challenges and, of being a founder and
Mhm.
launching something that almost like a newborn baby isn't quite
Yeah,
ready to walk yet.
yeah.
But in the work that you have engaged with a few organizations, what have you noticed has happened for them as a result of engaging in the lens? Of course, probably many of them are a long way from embracing it all, but what changes or shifts did you notice when they engaged in with your lens or framework?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I guess what's just going through my mind is the kind of, firstly, yeah, the type of people that are being drawn to this and the organizations they're with. And often I'm finding that they've already come, that they're already kind of there a lot of the time.
Okay.
And like you're saying, in a way, it's like what they find with the lens is, oh, you're giving voice to something in
Yeah.
this way that now, and I think probably then what I'm seeing the design lens do is it kind of um, it heightens or hones something that they're already doing, but it
Yeah.
just gives them a kind of direction, perhaps that
Okay.
they didn't have before. And
Okay.
what I've noticed with the organizational founders or leaders that have really pulled towards this or have been so far and have started to really grapple with it in a very full way is that um yeah that they will really wrestle with these questions. They'll be wrestling with like reflecting on their own worldviews, reflecting on their organizational worldviews. One of the conversations I had with recently with someone who's has did exactly that, has been grappling with their own their organization that they lead through the lens and this sense of what it is to be ecological, is that they talk a lot about their realization about the time frames and how important it is to really embody this work. That's very easy to look at the lens and go, kind of want to answer all the questions because there's a lot in that lens. But they were discovering that actually, which is how they started, but what they've realized now is that there is so much to unpack in every single question, and that now they're going to approach it as taking like one or two questions a year and really trying to get an embodied,
Yeah.
lived experience of living in that question seasonally over time to then
Yeah.
discover for themselves what the right way is.
Well, that is really inspiring to hear that there
Yes.
are individuals or organizations in this case taking it that seriously, because in a way modernity is framed that not to go too deep in a way,
Yes.
a sort of shallow framing or worldview. And but also one of the things that struck me as you were speaking, often people are already on the journey, but maybe the lens helps them articulate and clarify what they've done and then
Yes.
where they need to go. That's what it's
Absolutely.
you were saying to me.
I think that's very true. You
Yeah.
know, the people that I have the the kind of most exploratory conversations with about the lens are individuals that they might be reflecting that organization, but that have been really in deep inquiry about decolonialization, about worldviews, about and just haven't maybe just haven't quite grasped the next step. Or
Yeah.
I almost think as well, the lens in some ways seems to act as a permission, and I completely understand that. It's the same way, like I'm sure you've experienced this. We might be, yeah, I think we had a moment, we talked about this you're in a group meeting and someone shares a very vulnerable check-in, and that acts as a permission for the rest of us
Yeah.
to actually be true about what's happening for each of us.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think what the lens can often do is be that permission. It's
Okay.
almost like, okay, now I've got permission to really jump into this particular area, or it acts as maybe like some grounding, which is understandable. If we often, I think, we can feel quite individual in grappling with these
Yeah. Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can imagine if you're part of an organization that's in this business system and you're saying, but I want to think about this in a different way. I want to think about this in a multi-generational way, in a system that's set up to talk about 5-year returns.
Yeah.
It can be very, very lonely. And so I
Yeah.
think again, the lens acts as as that kind of permission, so that like you're not alone. We can do this together.
So we're in a world where we need permission to, we need permission and acknowledgement to explore the fact that we are ecological already.
Right. I mean, I don't know, do everyone feel like that? I don't know, but I think that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll close it there. Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. Was there any last thing you want to say or conclude with before I switch the recording off?
Maybe just to reiterate that the lens is in Creative Commons, so it's available for anyone within an organization that would like to explore some of these questions. And so they just need to go to ecologicalorganizations.org and they will find the online homepage and home depository where they find the lens in different formats, and they'll find some educational materials and some kind of information about funding and partnerships, and there's an FAQ. So there's quite a solid amount that's available to any organizational member that's really curious about this.
Cool. So I'll also include a link to your site and that
Wonderful.
when I'm publicizing the video, which will probably be in the middle or end of February.
Okay, great.
So thanks so much. I'm just going to turn off the recording.
All right, thank you.